According to the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders 5th edition, the DSM-5, published in 2013, autism spectrum disorder, ASD, includes two major criteria. 1. Persistent deficits in social communication and social interaction across multiple contexts, and 2. Restricted repetitive patterns of behavior, interests, or activities. If the first two criteria are met, 3 more criteria must be considered to determine a diagnosis of ASD. Symptoms must be present in the early developmental period. They must cause clinically significant impairment in social, occupational, or other important areas of social functioning, and such disturbances are not better explained by intellectual disability. The earliest reference to autism was in 1943 when Johns Hopkins physician Leo Kanner used the term to describe symptoms of schizophrenia. The first real diagnosis of autism appeared in the first edition of the DSM in 1952. The term autism and its subsequent eligibility categories have evolved with each new edition of the DSM. The publication of the DSM-4 identified 3 related disabilities: autism, pervasive developmental disorder or pervasive developmental disorder not otherwise specified, and Asperger's syndrome. Currently, the 2013 publication of the DSM-5 bundles all 3 disabilities identified in the DSM-4 into one broad disability, autism spectrum disorder. The confusing term in ASD is spectrum. All individuals, while many share similar characteristics, behaviors, and traits, are unique. Celebrated author and person living with ASD, Temple Grandin, describes the spectrum aspect of ASD. At one end of the spectrum, you might find the severely disabled. At the other end, you might encounter Albert Einstein or Steve Jobs. While early causes of ASD were thought to be psychological, contemporary considerations or causes are attributed to biology, specifically neurology or genetics. It is difficult to describe general characteristics of individuals identified with ASD. As mentioned earlier, the range of abilities across such a wide spectrum is almost impossible to generalize. However, there are some characteristics that tend to be demonstrated by individuals at many areas across the spectrum. One of the most prevalent characteristics of ASD is comorbidity with other disabilities. Having pointed out that people identified with ASD share characteristics of other disabilities, there are some characteristics that have a high prevalence regarding ASD. Rote memory, theory of mind, problem solving, and motivation are unique cognitive and academic characteristics of individuals with ASD. Rote memory is the ability to memorize a vast amount of information without partially or fully comprehending the meaning of such. Being able to memorize information at a high rate of accuracy is only an asset if the individual can contextually use and manipulate the information. The ability to memorize information can prove to be a deficit. Such an ability may install a false sense of confidence with other people who may mistake simple articulation for comprehension, thus stopping them from checking for understanding. Theory of mind is the belief people identified with AD do not perceive society and circumstances from any point of view other than their own. Theory of the mind may be considered a deficit in that it may prevent people with ASD from developing proper social interaction skills. Problem-solving skills present problems with accessing the information to figure a way out of a dilemma. Students who have profound problem-solving skills may become overly frustrated and angry, manifesting behavior that is socially inappropriate in the context of the situation. Motivation is a characteristic of ASD that is difficult to manage, but may be more difficult for people other than the person with the ASD. While it may be very easy to understand the likes and interests of people with ASD, it may be conversely very difficult for them to discover such in others. Language, communication, and immaturity are all examples of social and emotional characteristics of individuals with ASD. Many people with ASD have language disorders, proving to be extreme challenges with social and communication skills. The challenges are as wide as the spectrum itself. Some common characteristics include proximity to other individuals in conversation, tone and volume, inability to articulate words, reading, writing, etc. The list goes on and on. Individuals on the high-functioning end of the spectrum may be identified with Asperger's syndrome. It may be able to clearly communicate with spoken and written language, but may lack appropriate social characteristics such as not maintaining eye contact or speaking in a monotone style. Many people with ASD seem to lack maturity related to their same-age peers. Such a deficit may present itself in an inability to understand social cues, body and facial language, and even direct spoken communication. Self-stimulatory behaviors, generalization difficulties, and sensory issues are examples of behavioral characteristics that individuals with ASD may demonstrate. Self-stimulatory behaviors are what many people not identified with ASD may think of when they consider the disability. People with ASD may constantly engage in a repetitive physical movement that may appear very out of the ordinary in most contexts. Rocking, flapping of arms, rolling of the neck, making unique facial expressions, etc. are all examples of such. Many people identified with ASD may be able to perform certain tasks in one physical setting, may not be able to generalize and perform the exact same task in a different setting. This may be the case even when the settings are very similar to each other, such as a math classroom or a science classroom. About now, you're probably thinking there are not many assets regarding the characteristics of ASD. While the final characteristic of people with ASD definitely represents itself as a deficit, it may also be an asset in some cases. People with ASD may have sensory processing difficulties with any one or any combination of the 5 senses: sight, hearing, touch, smell, and taste. Some of the difficulties may be highly disruptive to cognitive and behavioral functioning, and in extreme cases even painful. However, if a person identified with ASD can harness their senses that benefit their perceptions, they could capitalize on them as strengths. Examples may include extreme sensitivity to hearing. Technical aspects of sound may present an asset to a composer. Similarly, the ability to see great detail may be an asset to an architect, or a person who perceives patterns may become a great software programmer. Diagnosing ASD typically happens at a very young age, and in many cases prior to the age of preschool. Like other disabilities, a team of professionals in the family meet to consider all aspects determining eligibility for special education services. They first consider the criteria of ASD as identified in the DSM-5. If the person meets the criteria, the focus quickly shifts to cognitive, academic, and adaptive abilities. This is done formally and informally, and is common to use observations to record specific behaviors. Different means of measurement depend on the age of the individual and their abilities related to the spectrum of abilities. After evaluating the person with eligibility criteria provided by the DSM-5, the team must consider a series of critical questions. Does the individual have ASD? Will the presence of ASD have a negative effect on his or her educational performance? Is the individual eligible for special education services? Will the individual benefit from special education services? Because of the vast differences, unique characteristics, and possible comorbidity with other disorders, it will be a long process of considering services for individuals with ASD that may very likely continue through high school, graduation, and transitioning into adulthood. The final consideration regarding the diagnosis process is the traumatic impact it may likely have on the parents. While this process never becomes easy, it is something professionals can learn from each time they have to work with families in this capacity. A professional best practice is to discuss this topic with a trusted mentor. When considering strategies to deliver meaningful curriculum and instruction to students identified with ASD, it is important to consider academic and cognitive levels of performance as related to the person's performance related to the spectrum and comorbidity with other disorders. This statement will resonate more clearly when considering developing intervention strategies to practice academic skills with a person identified with ASD and comorbidity with Down syndrome versus practicing with a person with ASD with comorbidity with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. The intervention specialist would obviously have some unique circumstances to consider. Some best practices to consider when planning for effective interventions include priming, discrete trial interventions, prompting, social stories, and success, an acronym: situation, options, consequences, choices, strategies, stimulation. Priming requires someone, a teacher, a peer, or a paraprofessional, to preview an activity or instructional strategy prior to a formal or informal intervention strategy takes place with the person identified with ASD. Discrete trial interventions is a practice or intervention that may take place over a longer period of time and can be practiced in settings other than in the classroom, at home, in special classes, during transitions, etc. Discrete trial intervention often includes a teacher given a prompt followed by an appropriate student response included with a prescribed reward. Prompting is simply cues initiated by the instructor to encourage the student to respond in a desired manner with the goal of improved performance. Social stories are individualized texts or stories often represented with pictures that describe a specific situation directly related to a particular person's challenge. Many times, such social stories can be created by the instructor, but for common challenges, social stories can be found in abundance online or in instructional catalogs. Examples of appropriate situations to utilize social stories may be to correct spitting, hitting, turn-taking, etc. Success, the acronym as mentioned earlier, situation, option, consequences, choices, strategies, simulation. This strategy can be implemented to an individual or in a group setting and is a very effective strategy to use when practicing peer tutoring. Due to the vast disparity of characteristics related to ASD, my presentation on the disability serves as a starting point. There are countless resources available that may likely help any intervention specialist garner some clarity, perspective, and/or direction toward designing cognitive, academic, and behavioral strategies to improve achievement. In most cases, the most powerful resource available is the parents or the family of the individual you may be working with. Capitalize on that resource, directly or indirectly. There are many internet assets that offer advice. The website Autism Speak discusses a parent's perspective. They offer a series of viewpoints, of categories, of suggestions they wish people would consider when they interact with their children. A couple highlights are, not autism is the same. Knowing one child with autism doesn't mean knowing anything, really. They're all different. Please don't tell my son doesn't have autism because he looks different than the other kid I know that has autism. Kids with special needs are smart, talented, creative, and thoughtful. It may not be obvious all the time, but their minds work differently. A quick reference to the website teaching.monster.com includes an article titled 22 Tips to Teaching Students with Autism Spectrum Disorder. While the information may seem overwhelming, most websites have internal search engines that can help aid your search for answers and guidance. Finally, there is a vast abundance of apps that you can download on tablets that may be beneficial for a student's particular needs. Now, more than ever, information is readily available 24 hours a day. Take advantage of all available resources and collaborate with all available stakeholders to best serve the unique needs of the students you are fortunate enough to work with. Thank you for your time.